Welcome to In the Landscape, a podcast on all things landscape design and care related, with your hosts Kate and Charles Sadler. Good to be back with you for another episode of In the Landscape. Thank you to all our repeat listeners. Welcome if this is your first episode. We hope there is information here that you will find useful and interesting, stuff that you can apply to your own landscape or even your own garden travels, because we will talk about some exciting gardens you might want to visit if this topic is of interest. I'm Kate Sadler, one of your hosts here at In the Landscape, and I'm in studio with my co-host, Charles.
Good to be here.
Hi, Charles. Charles Sadler, our resident landscape design expert, which is a title I haven't used in a few episodes, but it's true. So you're the landscape designer. I'm the not landscape designer. My background's in the performing arts, but we come together in this little weekly podcast to talk over concepts of design, trends in landscape design, useful tips for even things like pruning with an artistic eye. Mm-hmm. And so today's topic is actually all about designing the garden for children. Mm-hmm. Very near and dear to our hearts. Charles and I share a last name, and that's because we are married. And we met each other a little late in life, and we had our son through adoption also a little later in life. So we have a 16-month-old. And in fact, we're here in our home studio this week, and we're recording during nap time. Part of the challenge of making sure we get the podcast out weekly is finding quiet time to get in the studio. And so we certainly can relate to the challenges of early parenthood. And then I have nieces and nephews. You do, from both sides of our family. And they're in the teen years, which presents a whole other adventure. So one of the adventures of childhood that makes it such a rich experience is the connection I think I certainly had as a child in the landscape, you know, connecting to nature and things outside and that magical feel of the seasons, especially in summertime when you get to just be. There's no expectations.
I guess we experience the world through our senses. And being outside, it's quite acute. You can smell if there's fruit that's fallen and it's, you know, more or less like rotting on the ground. It's like a summery, earthy smell. Yeah, being in the landscape, it triggers your senses, brings you into the moment. I mean, children, and my experience is that they are in the moment, that they're not thinking of the past or the future much. And so when you're outside with a child, it brings the adult into the moment, the child's into the moment. And there's so much wonder by being outside with plants and other things in the landscape.
Absolutely. And those landscape structures, those organic features like a tree. I mean, we used to gather up the dead pine needles and make like birds' nests out of them and pretend we were birds. I mean, there's so much that the childhood imagination can make use of in the landscape to really, you know, make the most of that world. I think our sidewalks, we had a little bit of a hill on one side of the yard. This was growing up in Novato, California, which is in the Bay Area, which it can be quite hilly. As the grading moved from one property to the other, there was this little bit of a hillside that led up to the fence. And we would make the sidewalk lava and sort of like roll toward the lava and then pull ourselves up by the grass to get to the top. I mean, it was really quite spectacular. So
with the children's spaces, they don't necessarily need to be that programmed. You have interesting, beautiful elements in children's imagination, more or less creates the adventure. So I think, you more or less don't want things that are sharp, dangerous, poisonous, toxic. You stay away from those things and have some sun, some shade, places to sit. More or less children will create their own adventure. So having play structures, very elaborate, doesn't mean that it's more successful. Actually, we can talk about that later.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, it's a little bit like the outdoor room episode, where really the key component to whether you're going to use an outdoor room or not, is it in terms of temperature and sun exposure, is it comfortable? And my sense is sometimes play structures are used in the place of plantings, but in and of themselves, although they may create some shade, you know, it's not if it's a little cabin or something on top of a set of swings. Believe me, swings are fantastic and they may get used. But if you just set that out in a very sunny spot, you know, the inside of that little cabin could get quite hot. It's not insulated. Mm-hmm. And so it's actually going to be relatively uncomfortable if plantings are not also a consideration.
Right. I mean, that expression like build it and they will come, plopping a play structure in a landscape, that does not apply.
Yeah.
I mean, like over the years working in residential landscape design, I mean, it's sort of a tragedy, but many times I've been asked to remove play structures. The children outgrew them. Mm-hmm. And many times they weren't really that used. Mm-hmm. And they had to be, you know, taken away, and you try to find a home for it, donate it, give it away. But it's this laborious, it's assembled in place. So to get it out of there. Now, a public play structure is a little different because you have an ongoing population of children that are using it. But at a single family home, it's different. It's a short period of time that the children are going to be interested in it.
So we'll talk a little bit about design principles. You mentioned safety. I do know in the magical garden in Novato, where I grew up at a young age, one of the interesting shapes in the garden was the pyracantha tree, which I think had like 3-inch long spikes. I mean, that may be my childhood brain sizing it, but oh yeah, they're significant.
Yeah, they can be pretty deadly looking.
And it ended up getting ripped out pretty quickly after we moved in. I mean, it was not a safe tree, even though it was kind of low to the ground so you could get into the branches. I mean, you had to tread very carefully. I think my parents didn't think it was worth keeping in there. So we'll talk, you know, of course, about there's part of the magic of gardening for those of us who really love it is the connection to ecology, the ecosystem, the life cycle, and children can really be brought into that world, of course, with things like a vegetable garden or a little bed that they are participating in.
Right.
And they can see, you know, seeds germinate and sprout. I don't know, germination happens inside the seed, actually, but you see the sprout come up and you certainly witness plants grow and flower and bees come, and then, you know, the flowers no longer have a purpose, so they die and decompose. And, you know, all of that's it's very rich content for children in terms of an educational experience.
Yeah. I mean, just experiences with growing. I mean, when you plant seeds, some of them thrive, some of them don't. And you see the fragility of it, that there's a hailstorm or you're go away on vacation, you don't water, some of them die. I mean, those are all valuable lessons actually to, you know, for children, for everyone to learn that some of these activities that require attention, love, nurture, and that there's sort of acts of God. Sometimes if there's a hailstorm, like you might lose that food.
We sort of went over the list of really significant gardens and parks that included special landscape elements for children in particular. And I'm curious, I don't know if you know, is this a relatively new trend? To my eye, these gardens look a little bit newer, like they've almost been carved out of these older sort of institutional landscapes. Can you talk a little bit about which landscapes you think are of particular interest, and then maybe the trend in designing for children and how that relates to us as adults who are kind of rediscovering the gardens in a way?
Okay. Well, I remember my landscape architecture history. I remember some of it, to be honest.
I know how that goes.
So it would be similar to architecture. There was modernism, postmodernism, arts and crafts. With children's play structures and children's gardens, there have been those same eras. So people might remember the railroad tie era, where you have these big timbers. There was a playground in Central Park that was pretty recently, it was restored to its original, which might have, I'm going to guess, the 50s or 60s, maybe the 70s even. So it was this very modernistic concrete and other elements. So,
I mean, in terms of comfort, one of the vivid childhood memories I have of some of those parks, I mean, I was going to parks in the 80s, and I think maybe you went in the 70s, and is the bright metal slide that would heat up to like extraordinary temperatures and sort of blind you and scald you as you went down. So I don't know that, I mean, I would say materials science has had a lot to contribute to at least the structures that we think of in terms of children's play areas. But as we're going to kind of argue, I guess, as we get going, that it's the organic materials that are the most exciting. And we can make we can make much of those in our child designed landscapes.
So the history of, there's the different styles and the different materials through the generations.
And then the plastic ones have like build up static electricity. And
You get a shock or your hair stands up.
I guess what you said about it being like a sensory experience is really true, because you have all these I have all these memories that are sort of popping up.
Then there was even a period when I was in graduate school, which was like about more than 10 years ago now. Then there was a period of, I don't remember the exact term, but it's more or less like naturalistic play places or elements. So you'd have, instead of a swing set, you'd have 3 logs, and they might be connected, laying on the ground, and it would encourage you to walk and balance. So there's been that trend for a while now. So it's a play areas for children that has wonder, fascination, intrigue. It's interactive, but it's not so heavily programmed that you can only go down a slide.
One of the features of, I don't know, children's psychology, I'm not an expert. I don't know what this phenomenon is about, but we can certainly talk about it in terms of designing for children, is not just the open air structure, so the balancing logs or even the swing, but the enclosed structure, the sense that kids like to have little spaces. I'm sure it goes back to the comfort of the womb. But one of our favorite parks was in, I think it was in Larkspur, California. It was called the Dark Park because it had huge redwoods it was not a bright, sunny park. And so you felt, again, kind of like that magical element of being surrounded by this organic, organisms. And it had sort of your basic metal play structure, but it wasn't the sunshine necessarily that was a necessity for that to be an appealing space to play and explore.
But that the scale, we always talk about scale, whether that's a big design element, that it feels comfortable to the human scale. So a little person, a child, their scale is much smaller than an adult. And I love when I visit, preschools or schools or churches or other institutions, and they have a door that's made for a child only, where there's an adult door and then there's a window at the height of a young child. So play structures, buildings in the landscape that are just for children. I think that is successful. It's really programmed. Like you said, who's the client? The client's the child. So, and children loving some enclosure, and plants can also do that. You can, it could be a maze, where it's quite designed, or just even some enclosure. Children will make a game out of it. It doesn't have to be that elaborate. So I guess my sense would be, if I was designing a children's garden right now, thinking a tree is a great play structure for children to climb on. And there's trees that have lower branches. So something like that will invite children to play. And when it's not in use, it doesn't look like, this empty play structure that's sitting there.
Yeah, scale is so special at that age. And our son got one of those little push mowers that makes the bubbles from his nanny. And that's your mom. He leaves it out in the lawn. It's like in the middle of the lawn some mornings. And he has these little orange garden boots. I mean, he loves being outside and participating in the
landscape,
activity,
right?
Yeah, of the activity of the landscape. But it's the scale of those little objects that he kind of leaves in the yard that, remind you of the specialness of his playtime and all of that.
And the touching. I mean, we planted a bald cypress, and we walk over to that, and we touch that, and the bark feels different. He loves touching that, or the different types of shrub palms with all the foliage. And so some of those have spines closer to the trunk, but just there's like education. This is where you can touch. This is where you can't. So
what are some specific garden or park spaces that you found that you think folks maybe should get out and visit if they have the opportunity with their children?
Well, we've had the experience, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. They've had, I'm going to guess about 100 years old, maybe a little more now, that property. And they've had
This is the Brooklyn Botanic
Garden. Right, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. So they've had a children's vegetable or edible garden I believe it's many decades. It's more recently they have, I guess I'd call it an interactive children's garden that's play and education focused. And that was the firm Michael Van Valkenburg that we visited with a summer intern, Andrew. Mm-hmm. And so that would really follow these design suggestions, which I've read in the literature, that there's lots of natural materials. So the flooring, the furniture is wood, which is compatible. It's welcoming. It's not cold, or there was an overhead canopy. So there was shade. It was comfortable. It was very densely planted, like the surrounding area. So it's welcoming. It's interesting. So that was a highlight. The New York Botanic Garden in the Bronx, they've had a children's garden for many years, and it does have areas with lots of enclosure that's really for a children's scale. And a couple that I have not been to yet that get rave reviews are the Denver Botanic Garden and the Missouri Botanic Garden. The Denver one appears to be relatively, maybe they've updated or it's recent. And the Missouri, I'm not sure the age of that, but that also looks fantastic.
For those listeners who, want to go, I did say going with your children, but of course there's the inner child that all of this sort of talk almost inspires that sense of certainly my own childhood and the excitement that we still can feel as adults if we grant ourselves permission, I guess, to kind of experience the landscape in that way, the touching, the smelling. I'm mindful that a lot of these gardens have elements that would invite wildlife, safe wildlife, I guess. We have to watch out for anything that's not, but, something simple like milkweed for butterflies so that children can observe. We would get, what is it called? Swallowtail butterflies. They're yellow with the distinctive wings, and they make their cocoon. They eat and then make the cocoon on fennel, I think. Oh,
I remember you saying that, and I'm familiar with that.
And
that sounds right.
And so there's the distinctive smell. There's observing the life cycle of the caterpillar and the butterfly, and so all of that is stuff that we can be mindful of as we're planning the garden for our children or ourselves as children.
That's right.
We want to think along those lines.
Yeah, that same summer intern Andrew visiting children's gardens, like we went to both NYBG and the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. I mean, he gravitated toward that. So it's all your state of mind. It's like you can be young at heart, the elements that appeal to children. Now, there's also when we went to, there was a section of the Brooklyn, is it the waterfront?
Waterfront Park, I think. Yeah.
Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah.
Brooklyn Bridge Park. It was like closer to Atlantic Avenue, which was adjacent to the water. And we went to that had many nooks and crannies, enclosures. More or less, there were tunnels created by plants. And there was a mist element, and you walked into it, and there were children running, back and forth underneath you, almost like it created a very animated, exciting space.
That's so true. And, a few of these concepts I do think apply for those of us for whom our pets are our children. Like Hudson, our younger Cocker Spaniel, loves the nooks and crannies of the yard. She really she'll sort of get into the spaces. Our cat, Mittens, likes to have plants to sort of hide behind. She's not outdoors too often. We hope she's not. I don't think she's ever hurt a bird. I know that can be an issue. But anyway, the idea that you are planning for safety. So there are things that you don't want your children to eat. You don't want your pets to eat. And then an ability to kind of feel a part of the landscape, to sort of hide and get into it in a way so that you can kind of lose yourself into it when you're at a certain size.
Well, plants, like our New York townhouse garden, foliage plants. So perennials, we used Ampsonia quite a bit. We used boxwood and then many flowering shrubs. So those are all quite compatible, that you can make your way through them like a maze, even though they probably would vary in height from like 30 inches to waist height. And then the shrubs were about 6 feet tall. And so that created like a labyrinth, more or less.
And there was a lot of motion in that garden, which was nice. We've had of course, in researching this, or certainly, I mean, one of the techniques used to create a space is to do the sunflower room. But that's somewhat static. I mean, once it's there, it's very firm, which is nice.
Which is maybe just to explain that would be, it could be a circle, a square, where the shape is lined with sunflowers. And then as they grow up, it creates an interior space, which children like interior space. I mean, and so do adults.
I was just thinking corn has that effect, but the leaves it's not comfortable. Like if you kind of brush up against it. So I do, in thinking of the Amsonia, for example, it's a very soft kind of feel and has that kind of waviness. So kind of moving through it in the labyrinth context is actually appealing. But the idea that not every plant kind of has a nice feel to it, whether it's dangerous or not, I mean, that's something else to consider. It's the softness.
That is durable too. Like Amsonia, a dog can more or less fall into it. And children could fall down on it. It's durable. Maybe some of the stems would break. It's not a fragile plant. That's really a component that it's not going to hurt the child, and then more or less that the child's not going to hurt it, or that it can stand up to it, or something like a very fragile, like a dwarf rhododendron or some of these plants that grow slowly. If you broke a third of the branches, it might never recover. It might look like that. So that wouldn't be a good choice for an area where there's young children.
That's a good point. Also, mobility is an issue for young children. Grading, and I'm also thinking of our soil episode where we did talk about not wanting to compact the soil. So providing paths that are sort of baked into we don't want to over-program it so that children have that sense of recreating in their minds afresh every time they're in the landscape, something imaginative, but providing stepping stones. Those can be very appealing. And that can be protective of kind of the root systems. But what about things like gravel? I mean, do children do well on, Daniel just kind of goes from the concrete to the grass. And even that transition was a challenge for a little bit, but he's very mobile. So he's running right around.
If it's a step, then it's very apparent that it's a step. I mean, that can actually happen with people at the end. As with dementia or as we age, our perception of depth and shadows, it can be hard to read it. I'm guessing it'd be the same for children. So if it's a step, then it's very obvious that it's a step. Or if you have, let's say, bluestone steps, which are the same color, and if the if there's not a shadow, it can be hard to perceive. So either having things that are flush. I know children and actually pets like to put things in their mouth. So gravel, the finer, like the pea stone, that's quite nice. That could get distributed everywhere. Yes. I know dogs eat that. Children could eat that. So thinking if a path is needed, I would agree that it's more or less the elderly and children both smooth paving surfaces. So it's like minimize steps, make it very clear where you're going, that there's not discrepancies, and then it's predictable. If there's steps, you don't want to have a single step usually. It's better to have ideally 3 steps. A single step, I've done that. You're walking along, you don't expect it, and you trip.
Yes. Yeah. I've experienced that too. That makes me think that perhaps being creative with handholds, especially if it is an organic, item, that if it happens to be near where stepping is happening, that children especially are liable to reach out and hold on to things. So you may want something like a container as the support as opposed to a shrub itself, because that could face some
having
damage.
Having a railing that's the height of a child. It could be a double, There's probably, I haven't come across it, but I bet there's guidelines for railings for a child height.
Well, and you mentioned the gravel, which makes me think also of beautiful beds that are mulched.
Right.
Just think that you do not want mulch everywhere either. So you may want to consider, we're kind of proponents of, ground cover anyway that fills in and helps keep the weeds at bay. If you can get that established, then you don't have to do as much weeding or mulching. So if you can find, and again, childhood memories, one of my favorites, and I honestly don't know what the scientific name is, but it grew like crazy in the kind of cool sort of wet Bay Area climate, and baby tears. They're like these tiny little leaves and very green.
I think I can picture that. I can't remember the scientific name,
and they would be, again, speaking of scale, you could play in the beds with your little figurines, and somehow it was like the right scale for their world. So that was all very, very entertaining. But those ground covers can be a really special, it's at the right level for children. There's some flower also that's like little and white, and it almost looks like it's its own bouquet of flowers.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. It's not coming to mind.
Right.
There's a dianthus. That's one. I'm not sure if that's what you mean, but
yeah.
So from getting into the colors, bold colors, groups of colors, more or less like massing plantings. That's what the literature says, more or less, that's appealing to children. It's appealing to adults too. So you can perceive an area, like a large swath of black-eyed Susans, let's say, would be an example. Things that are nice to touch, herbs that are aromatic. So when you brush up against them, or plants that, like when I've been doing landscape consultations at a nursery or other places, I always try to seek out plants that the children can touch and encourage them. Touch this with the rosemary, the different kinds of mint. So instead of saying don't touch, trying to design for do touch.
That's great. And maybe also considering as we look out the windows and we're assessing our design, to if there is a children's bedroom and you want to make something special for them, to whether it's with a professional designer who's consulting with you or you're thinking of it yourself, take in that view. Maybe your children, for whatever reason, have a view of the back fence and then the neighbor's yard. It's just not, it may not be appealing. And yet there's so much kind of soothing and comforting psychological benefit that we get when we have nice things to look at. Having your child's view, which they may see as they're doing homework or just spending time in their room, would be something to consider.
Right, to attract
not to leave them
birds, pollinators.
Yeah.
And that things that are seasonal. I know children, that's enjoyable to everybody. And it flowers, then it maybe develops berries and it loses its leaves.
Yeah. So you found some resources in preparing for this episode that relate to actually gardens in children's healthcare. We're working on a whole healthcare episode. The healthcare garden is hugely beneficial. There's some exciting developments in that arena, and it applies to all of us as we'll all go through changes in health status over our lifetimes. But in terms of children and children's hospital gardens, what were you able to find out?
Well, let's see. This one, this is from the Journal of Environmental Psychology, which I'm familiar with. It's titled Evaluating a Children's Hospital Garden Environment, Utilization and Consumer Satisfaction. And this is a San Diego Children's Hospital. So they did what's called a post-occupancy evaluation, where this garden was built, and then after a period of time, they evaluate what's working, what's not working. So some of the key, and I think this could apply to the residential garden too. Many of the hospital occupants, the parents and the staff, they didn't know that the garden existed. So when you're designing a garden, making it easy to get to, and awareness. So if you can see the garden from your back porch, I guess so it's integrated and it's programmed into your lifestyle is important. So it's used and that there's awareness of where it is. Other suggestions from the users was the children gardens often have lots of hardscaping, lots of built structures, which people and children don't tend, it's not welcoming. So the suggestion was to have more greenery, more trees and shrubs. Then the third suggestion was more things for kids to do. So pouring water, there's water tables, there's like sand boxes, sand tables. It doesn't have to be that complicated or sophisticated, but just activities for children.
I do know sandboxes are a challenge because of wildlife and the tendency to want to use them as a restroom. So get the one that has the cover if you're going to use it. And that's pretty much standard these days if you don't install it yourself. But if you do install it yourself, you'll have to be careful about that. And then the next one. Okay,
the next article was from Warsaw University of Technology in Poland, and the Faculty of Architecture. The author was, I'm going to do my best, Weronika Katarzyna Lipka. And so the article is Multisensory Architecture, Filling the Space by the Disabled children on the example of Educational, Therapeutic, and Rehabilitation Center. So the takeaways that I thought were valuable there, this was the design of a children's garden in an existing larger landscape. And so that would be true whether it's a public park or at your own home. The children's garden should fit and should be respectful of the surrounding landscape. So it doesn't look like it was just plopped down and it doesn't make sense. It should be integrated in a design sense, which is it'll look prettier, it'll be utilized, and it'll have like a lifespan. It won't look outdated after a period of time. Let's see. I mean, and the key takeaway is, which I really agree with, it says when designing for children, the garden ought to support their development. So that's really the program. Is it educational, inspiring, intriguing? Does it create wonder? So those are all, like we talked about, plants blooming, plants moving in the wind, growing edible plants. Those would all fall into that.
Certainly, accessibility is a concern for many parents who have children with, differing abilities. And if we are designing for professionals listening to this podcast, designing for parks or gardens, it's important to know those standards. We are planning an episode on accessibility in the garden. And so we hope to put together some, a discussion of the topics of universal design, which is to make it sort of open to everyone with the least amount of
barriers. Really.
Barriers, yeah. Like it's not obvious that things are designed just to allow all human beings to use them equally. And if it is a unique challenge to you and your family, there will be designers out there who could help. So if you're not quite sure what to do with your garden to help make it, accessible to all your children, then maybe seek out a designer and get kind of the insights into universal design, which could benefit. Or again, if there's a room in particular that the child's looking out of a significant period of time, making that a special view or something like that. It's nice to be able to kind of bring everybody into the landscape.
Right. And the lessons learned from public landscapes that are accessible with people with varying mobility, those same lessons could be applied to the residential landscape. And those are quite well documented in American Institute of Architects, American Society of Landscape Architects. There are lots of precedents. And so a designer could tap into that and they could more or less follow like a route to success.
Anything else to add this episode?
Oh, let's see.
As nap time winds down to a close.
I always like to encourage foreseason interest. That's always great. And maybe a parting visual would be to create a teepee or like a tent-like structure. That came up repeatedly, where whether out of bamboo poles or other wooden structures, creating a cone that would be 5, 6, 7, 8 feet tall. And then you're by default creating an interior space and creating a lattice with twine and growing edibles, beans, or other things over there. So you create a play place for the child underneath it. And it's seasonal. So in the winter, it's depending on the climate, it's more or less just the structure. And then the climbers over the course of the season grow up and then they can be harvested.
Well, and depending on the development and the age of your child, construction projects in the landscape are also fun. If you create a birdhouse together and then the child can observe birds visiting that, or this structure in particular, having even little hands help hold up the sticks as you bind them together is a nice way to allow children participation in the creation of their own space.
That's right.
All right. Well, thanks so much for listening. And we're looking forward to having a few other great topics coming out for you in the next few weeks. And we're always excited to hear feedback. Stay tuned at the end for our email address and information about the show. If you have anything you'd like to add, we always welcome questions. And we're looking forward to our next topic in the landscape.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
In the Landscape is brought to you by King Garden, a full-service landscape design, care, and education company. Enjoying what you hear on our podcast? We encourage you to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen. We'd love to hear from you, so drop us a line at connect@kinggardeninc.com. We welcome show ideas, gardening and design questions, and always corrections. We travel all over North America giving garden talks and leading trainings. Check us out at kinggardeninc.com for our speaking details, and also take a look at our online course offerings for more in-depth explorations of topics covered on our show.